Well, I want to talk today about migration. It tends to be rather a neglected area in demography for reasons which I'll describe and expand on later on. It is, however, becoming really very important as the major factor in population dynamics in rich countries. And this is something relatively new and to which demographers perhaps haven't properly adapted themselves yet. So what I want to talk about is migration in the broader context of demographic thought and demographic analysis, the importance of migration or the non-importance of migration in population change and various other things, the difficulties of migration theory, which are great. You may think that fertility on migration is confused and indecisive. Wait till you hear about migration theory, and then you'll think that fertility analysis is really quite straightforward. I want to talk also descriptively about the process and diversity of migration in the modern world and the volume of migration, just to give you some idea about its magnitude, its trend, where it comes from, where it might be going in the future, to talk about also its consequences, demographic, economic, and ethnic, which is an awful lot to get through in 50 minutes, so I better get cracking without further ado. One of the first difficulties, and I'm sorry to begin with difficulties, but it's important to give some health warnings about migration. One of the great difficulties is the data. On the whole, and generally speaking, in the developed world anyway, data on births and deaths are pretty good. Very, very high coverage, 99-point-something% coverage of births and deaths, usually collected with all sorts of fairly reliable information about date, location, age of mother, circumstances of that kind. With migration, it's different. And that's because migration is so much a more complicated business. It's not just the convenient, once-for-all biological beginning points and end points of getting born and dying, which everyone only does once, well, with one or two exceptions, perhaps. With migration, it's quite different. With migration, you do it many times. It happens at enormous volume. There are over 100 million passenger movements into and out of the UK every year, of which some proportion are migrants in the demographic sense of the word, but the great majority are not. Sifting out the ones of demographic interest, those who are coming for a long time, intending to stay for a long time, those who are leaving for a long time, intending to be away for a long time, is very difficult. And this is true of all countries in the world. And of course, people also fundamentally only get born and die for rather specific reasons. For migration, there's a whole range of reasons why people move from all sorts of different places and different places where they go to as well. So it's a much more heterogeneous process than the firm biological beginning and end points of birth and death with which demographers tend to feel rather more at home. So first of all, some moans about data. As you see here, first of all, as I tried to expand briefly a few seconds ago, it is rather a fuzzy category, ill-defined, variable, but present in enormous volume. The data on migration, although attempts are being made to harmonize them via the European Union, via various international conferences organized by the United Nations and other bodies, the definition of migration and the way that it's counted still depends very much upon national legal procedures. Migration in and out of a country in the long term is a process which most countries govern by means of laws with varying degrees, of course, of reliability and precision. Those laws differ between countries because countries have different views about the place of migration in their national life, in their economy, and all the rest. Some try to restrict it, some try to encourage it, at least in respect of particular kinds of streams and particular kinds of people. This generates lots and lots and lots of different international, national rather, laws about who may enter, who may leave, even under what circumstances they may stay. Harmonizing these data has not been easy. It is getting better. But it's still very far from being perfect. I mentioned that the processes of migration were very diffuse. People enter and leave for a whole lot of reasons, for labour, as asylum seekers, as spouses, as children, as dependents, as students, all sorts of reasons for leaving and coming. And these are not necessarily correlated with each other. Two particular examples. The first thing is that when you see migration data presented to you in neat tables by Eurostat or some other body, these migration data are usually not actually migration data at all. They are not, for the most part, people being counted in or counting out as they enter or leave the borders of the country concerned. For the most part, they are derived from population registers of the kind which are common in continental Europe and do not exist in Britain. And the migration is derived from a comparison of the register of foreigners in one year and the register of foreigners in the other year, in the belief and assumption that those who enter the country legally will register on the foreigners register, those who leave will deregister. The difference is going to be net migration. There are also direct counts of those coming in, those being given legal leave to enter. The trouble is that most countries don't restrict emigration. The communist countries did until 1989. Certain other authoritarian dictatorships forbid their citizens to leave. Most free democratic countries do not forbid anyone to leave except criminals. And therefore, counting in is done accurately according to laws about admission and settlement. Counting out tends to be very much more feeble. So therefore, we have gross inflows based on counts. We have net flows based upon comparison of registered data. And of course, for demographic purposes, it's often the net flows, the difference between people coming in and people going out, which has the effect upon population size, population age structure, and also on the economy. Is that which we're most interested in, and that which we tend to have least of all. Secondly, if one's looking not at the flow of migrants, but at the so-called stock, I don't like using that name. It rather suggests that one's engaged in the grocery trade, but that is the term of art in migration. The stock of migrants is the number of people of migrant origin born overseas, living in a country at a particular time. Estimating that, which of course is also important, as well as the flow, is difficult because of the process of naturalization. Generally speaking, countries are interested in counting foreigners rather than immigrants in terms of their population. That is to say, those who are non-citizens compared with those who are citizens, irrespective of where they were born. In the past, naturalization, the acquisition of citizenship by migrants, tended to be a rather slow process and was a consequence of having been settled peacefully in a country for many years, having adapted to that country, speaking its language, understanding its laws and so on. Not a very easy process, particularly in the German-speaking countries where the jus sanguinis was the principle and where it was possible to be born in that country of foreign parents but not be a citizen, because the jus soli, the right of citizenship arising out of birthplace, did not apply. That is changing, but it has meant that there's been some alteration about the relationship between migration on the one hand and foreign citizenship on the other. More recently, naturalization, the granting of citizenship, has been used as a kind of, not as it were as a reward for integration, but as a means to integration. It has been greatly accelerated. What this tends to mean is that in some countries, the pace of naturalization has been so great that it is about the same as the pace of migration. So even though the number of migrants entering a country each year may be very great, the total stock of foreigners remains constant because so many of the migrants are naturalized very rapidly. You may, of course, feel this is a perfectly right and proper thing to do, but it does mean there's a growing mismatch between estimates of the number of foreign population, foreign origin population based upon citizenship on the one hand, and estimates of that based upon migration on the other. Here's a not untypical case from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, which has a population register, like so many continental countries, it's possible to work out from the register where people were born and where their parents were born, that is to say whether they are immigrants or the children of immigrants, as well as whether they are citizens or not. The orange line at the bottom is the datum normally cited when you look up Eurostat for foreign population, and that's often taken to be the same as immigrant population. As you see, the foreign population in the Netherlands has been hovering around 600,000 ever since about 1992 or so, and is not showing any upward trend. If you look at the number of people born abroad, which is the red line, you will see, in fact, it's been increasing constantly, but lots and lots of them have been naturalized. The foreign population in the Netherlands is about 1.6 million, not 600,000. If you look at the foreign origin population, that is to say the population which the Dutch categorize on the basis of the background of parents as well as of immigrants, then this is the total here. It's about 3.4 million, and that's out of a population of the Netherlands of about 17 million people, so it's a very substantial proportion of the total, about 20%. And this is not an indication of the number of people of foreign birth or foreign origin in the Netherlands or in Sweden or in France or in Britain. Very important to realize that the salience of migration has varied hugely over the course of time. In the beginning, we were all migrants, in the short term and migrants in the long term, because, of course, until about 10,000 years ago, all our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They had no fixed abode, fixed broad territory, for sure, over which they would tend to wander. No settled home, because hunters and gatherers, with very, very few exceptions, as you will know very well from anthropology, tend to exhaust the resources of their local area within a week or 2 weeks or a month, then move on somewhere else within a very, very wide area, eventually coming back to that first place once game, once roots, once berries have had a chance to regenerate in 1, 2, or many years later on. So migration is an essential survival strategy, not only for all early human populations over the greater part of our existence, but also, of course, as a survival strategy for most animal populations. Animals migrate about. Sometimes the migrations are well known in animals from the point of view of moving to Africa for the winter, as swifts and swallows do. Otherwise, it's much more localized. But it is normal. Migration is a normal state of affairs for early humans and for animals. Another slightly different kind of migration, which has been of enormous importance, is a kind of once-for-all colonization invasion migration, whereby the world was populated by human beings, starting, as we all know, out of Africa in 2 waves, one of Homo erectus, one of Homo sapiens, our lot, as it were, and then succeeded by other kinds of colonization later on, which I will point to. Large-scale movements of people of a kind of once-for-all kind were intermittently characteristic of human history and dominated it to some extent right until the 15th century, something which is now more or less not seen anywhere in the world. But this so-called Völkerwanderung period, which extended up to the 15th century, if you include the Mongols and the Turks, was powerful in changing cultures and also the origins of population of huge areas of the world. And if you like, it continued into the 19th century, if you include in that the enormous migrations of Europeans out of Europe into the Americas, into the Antipodes and elsewhere, well, which still continues, which was primary in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what this leads to, of course, is globalization. Globalization of people, globalization of diseases, perhaps eventually, through different processes, globalization of culture as well. But globalization is a very, very ancient process, been going on for 30,000 years. It is not something which is new. Oh, just an example of some of our early migrant ancestors. This is the only, I promise you, picture of a naked lady I shall show in the entire course of lectures. Here are some more recent migrants, the Bushmen of Botswana, the Kung San, now, alas, forced to settle down and wear trousers, but this is a picture of them in their natural hunting habitat with their, frankly, rather pathetic bows, which are equipped, thank goodness for them, with poisoned tips, as I'm sure you all know. This is the conventional diagram of this great colonization of the world population out of Africa, starting perhaps 130,000 years ago, extending to various different parts of the world at different points in time. The estimates of the time period by which this happened are, of course, subject to modern research and revision. This is now thought to be rather older than 13,000 years. That older than 20,000 years, there's some evidence, there's uncertainty about what went on in Australia, but clearly earlier than in the Americas. And before then, there were no Homo sapiens in those areas at all. It's a completely new pattern of settlement with huge consequences, as we all know, for population, ecology, and all the rest. This still, if I can add a footnote, this still leaves traces in the genes. You will know, I'm sure, from Christian Capelli and others, that it is still possible to trace the evidence for these settlements of Europe progressively over time by looking at the gene frequency distributions of contemporary, modern, living human populations. These gene frequencies are of no social importance of any kind, but they do give a shadow of the past, showing how a population of Europe extended itself in this north-westerly direction, starting from the Middle East and Anatolia. it's even possible, if you look at the material in sufficient detail, to reconstruct the map of Europe solely using this evidence. On the left, you see a diagram of the first two principal components of the analysis of a great deal of genetical data gathered from lots and lots and lots of different human populations in Europe. They're all labeled. You probably can't see. This says IT for Italy. This says ES for Spain. This says HR for Hungary. This says IE for Ireland. That's where the individual came from which the sample was taken. And this is where they're located on these two principal components, solely on the basis of statistical evidence of the gene distributions. And as you can see, it does somewhat replicate the map. This is the same color coding of the map itself. Here is Spain in purple. This is where most of the Spaniards end up. Here is Ireland in red, and this is where most of the Irish end up, and so on. So it's still a very considerable interest from a genetical point of view, even though it doesn't have any social significance at all. Once upon a time, there was a European Union which extended over, as you see, much more than the present European Union, although if Europhiles have their way, then the European Union will, of course, include Turkey and the northern shores of Africa and so on. And that is an example of something which was not so much created by migration, but by military conquest and control, but was disrupted by the migration processes that I'm about to talk about in the course of this lecture. Because this is the Roman Empire as around about 120 AD. This is the Roman Empire about 300 years later. The eastern part, often neglected, still going strong, although in diminished form for another 1,000 years. Based on Constantinople, the Western Roman Empire fractured, fragmented, then under the control of other non-Roman authorities deriving from populations like the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Lombards, the Franks, the Teutons, and various others, carving up Europe in this way. Not replacing or destroying the original populations, although numbers did indeed go down, but certainly changing their culture radically, changing their population mix, and that certainly wasn't the end of the story. And if I was to start on that story, it would go on for a long time, because the risk of caricaturing myself and sounding like 1066 and all that, a lot of history at this time was indeed the history of successive waves of people who are called barbarians. Sometimes it seems to me with some justice. Is that visible? Yeah, it is. One small, even smaller footnote, which I hope you'll excuse. This doesn't wipe out local differences. This is a map, two maps put together by Longley and his colleagues at University College London, showing the distribution of surnames. You look up your own surnames on Longley's website and see where people with your surname are geographically concentrated. This is a geographical concentration of a surname which happens to be derived from a unique place name in Lancashire. That place name is Ramsbottom. Now, first point here is that Ramsbottom as a place name has nothing to do with rams and nothing to do with bottoms. Rams is the old-fashioned word for wild garlic, still occasionally used. Bottom is a word of Norse origin meaning valley. So Ramsbottom means valley of the wild garlic, not something more comic. Anyway, this is where most of the Ramsbottoms were in 1881. And this is a surname originating probably, certainly in the early Middle Ages and possibly earlier on than that. These are the Ramsbottoms even in 1998. These are the most powerful concentrations. You would find them all over the place, but still remarkably concentrated, although diffusing, despite 1.5 millennia, or certainly 1 millennium of that place name originating in one small spot somewhere around there. So not everything gets wiped out by the process of migration and history. There was a time, much about 30 years ago, when demographers didn't pay much attention to migration. The illustrious journal Population Studies, under the managing editorship of the illustrious Eugene Grebenik, on the whole refused to take papers on migration. It was thought it was an unsuitable subject for demography, best left to geographers and other such folk. This has all changed, not the least because, of course, of the enormous importance of migration as its pattern has changed. This neglected two things. First of all, it neglected a very important paper by Kingsley Davis and followed up by others, which pointed out that migration, as I was trying to suggest right at the beginning, was a very important element of flexible response to demographic change. In other words, that if population started to grow in some way which was causing difficulties, then there were three options, not two. Not only could you die as a consequence of the population pressure, not only could you reduce your birth rate, which of course was the normal pattern assumed to be the case in the demographic transition, but also you could migrate. And people often did migrate, and this was part of a repertoire of responses, which tends to be neglected for various reasons in demographic thought, and still is, I think. Migration was relatively minor once the great movement of peoples was over by the 16th century, between settled states at peace with each other in Europe. And that's one reason why it tended not to be studied very much. What really mattered, the big actors were birth rates and death rates, particularly birth rates, particularly the contrast between the two in the demographic transition. In the demographic transition, enormous rates of population growth arising because of the prior decline of the death rate compared with the birth rate. Migration did take place, on the whole, it was out of Europe, not into Europe, and therefore it tended to be ignored. However, what the demographic transition in Europe did was, in generating much larger numbers of people than previously had existed there, it facilitated outflows to the rest of the world. These outflows, of course, had started in 1492, but accelerated to enormous levels by the end of the 18th and the 19th century. About 54 million Europeans are believed to have left Europe between 1815 and 1914 to live elsewhere. A lot of them in the Americas, but also in other parts of the world as well. Now, of course, for every migration flow, there's always a counterflow. Some of those people came back. We don't know how many, maybe as many as a third of those who came back. Some have gone back again. It wasn't an absolutely fixed business. Migration never is, hence partly its difficulty. Nonetheless, an enormous outflow, which may have been rather ignored in terms of demographic analysis and interest until recent times, but had a huge impact, of course, on the populations into which those Europeans moved. Typically, populations in North and South America of much simpler culture or much less resilient culture, highly vulnerable to European diseases, vulnerable to European military prowess. In Australia, in North and South America, enormous population losses. The matter is still controversial and somewhat heated, but it's thought that the population of the Americas was reduced to maybe 10% of its previous level among the indigenous population, even though the European population, of course, expanded very rapidly. So not to be ignored if you were living in that part of the world. As far as theory is concerned, I hardly know where to start because there's a lot of it about, and it would take really a couple of lectures even to scratch the surface properly. Much migration theory is quite properly devised by economists using economic considerations and assuming that economic pressures, economic advantages are the primary motivation of migration, which may well not be the case. In fact, I think clearly is not the case, despite its importance. Essentially, the idea is that insofar as there is free movement or easy movement from one population to another, that migration will take place if wages in the receiving country are higher than wages in the sending country, if there is an abundance of capital in the receiving country and a shortage of capital in the sending country, and that migration will take place between the two until these things are equilibrated, where the availability of capital and the level of wages are about the same in both places. Under those circumstances, net migration anyway will cease, and population flows will come to an end, and population change therefore will come to an end. Well, that sort of works, but there are so many exceptions to it that it's not a very reliable guide to predicting migration or to analysing it. One has to think of a number of other things, the way in which labour markets can become segmented between jobs for immigrants and jobs for natives, the way in which migration can be a household financed business. The costs of migration are not negligible. Very often migration is regarded in poor countries as a kind of investment into which the whole family and other members of kin, perhaps, or even villages, will invest money into a migrant in the expectation that a migrant will send back remittances from the very much higher wages which he can earn in the richer country to which he is moving, for example. On top of that, given that most large-scale migration over the last several decades has been from poor countries to rich ones, and given that most of those poor countries are countries of familyist culture, where kinship is important, family size large, household structure complex, there is naturally a tendency once individuals have moved from one country to another one, from a poor country to a rich one, from a more familist country to a more individualist country, for that person to seek to bring their relatives across, to marry someone of origin in that country, therefore of dependable culture, not of the different alien culture into which they've moved, and so on. That generates very large volumes of continual network-based chain migration, cumulative causation, as Doug Massey calls it, who is one of the great theorists of migration theory, which in theory can go on and on and on and on, with more people arriving, generating more flows, and more people arriving and generating more flows. It does eventually, it seems, come to an end, but certainly hasn't come to an end so far. And over the last few decades, most movement into European countries has been arising out of dependents, spouses, new spouses, and existing spouses, children, and all the rest. Not so much in labour migration. That was earlier on, and although it continues, it has been added to by this enormous impetus from chain migration arising out of family and kin connections. There are also other important factors which we have to keep into consideration. One of the reasons, of course, why these disparities arise in the first place is because of the historically unequal pace of development of economic growth in different parts of the world and of population growth in different parts of the world. If all the world had grown rich more or less at the same time, if the demographic transition had not taken place first of all in the West and later on outside Europe and the Western countries, then these migration flows would have been very much more modest, and there would have been of the kind that one sees all the time between countries of roughly equivalent demographic characteristics and roughly equivalent economic status. Geographical proximity matters a lot as well. It's not just a question of you can't vanish the effects of distance. Thus, in earlier times anyway, most European migrants into Britain came from Ireland. Most European migrants into Sweden came from Finland, which is next door and was indeed part of Sweden at one time, just as Ireland was part of the UK at one time. These political historical connections are very important. That's why, looking rather further afield, migrants into France in recent years have tended to come from French colonies in Africa and from the neighbouring countries on the northern shore of North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, which were once French colonies. You can think of many other examples, I'm sure. State policy must not be ignored. Migration does not take place in a policy vacuum. There are almost all countries maintain controls on migration, and some maintain controls on emigration as well. These are of varying effectiveness and change from time to time in rather an erratic way according to the unpredictable outcome of elections. For example, in Britain recently, in 1997, the question of migration hardly featured in the general election of 1997 that brought Mr. Blair to power. Within 2 or 3 years, the Blair government had radically changed the migration policy away from being a restrictive one into being a much more permissive one, believing that economic growth and social change of a beneficial kind would happen if migration could be expanded, with the consequence of a very considerable increase in flows, which was not forecast or expected by anyone. And the reversal in 2010, of course, has brought the coalition government to power, which seeks to control that migration more than was the case in the past, with what success we will see in due course. Also very important are the post-war revolutions in transport, in information, and in rights. Transport and information which created a possibility previously non-existent of people moving from South Asia, from remote parts of Africa, from all over the world into a Europe which was previously cut off effectively by the cost of transport and the weakness of information. On top of that, of course, the enormous increase in consideration for human rights arising out of the horrors of the Second World War, which binds together countries through the European Court of Human Rights, which you heard about in our papers today, to undertake to respect the right to family and various other rights of migrants, which has greatly restricted the powers of most European countries in what they can do with their own domestic migration policy. Here are some of the examples of diversity in migration. This is a graph from the OECD. It's 2003. It's not up to date, but it shows you how diverse things can be. Here they have broken up gross migration flows. This is inflow only, not net flow, into three major components. In pale blue are asylum seekers and refugees. In deep blue is family reunification and new spouse migration. And in pale are people entering for purposes of work. And you see that in Australia, Switzerland, at that time, the UK, workers were predominant. In France, the United States, Sweden, Denmark, essentially family was dominant. In fact, in Sweden in 2003, only 3% of persons entering Sweden lawfully did so for purposes of work. Almost all the rest were either seeking asylum or as family members of one kind or another. Huge variation over time. And this is just one example from France. It's impossible to present all the data from all the countries, not the least because it is not produced in comparable fashion. These are just some data from France, very much simplified in 2005, showing the proportion of people entering France. This is gross migration inflow only. We don't know what the pattern or balance will be for the net flow. Coming into France from the European Economic Area, that's the EU plus Switzerland and Norway and one or two other countries, and this is from outside Europe. Only 3% of those entering France from the EEA were students, but 37% were workers. That's the single biggest category apart from other, which includes retired people and all sorts of other categories. Quite different from those entering from Europe. A quarter of those were students, only 5% were workers, half were family, and so you see this enormous contrast with about 80% of the inflow coming from outside Europe and 20% coming from inside Europe. That's not untypical, I think it's fair to say, of what goes on in the rest of Europe. I just happen to have these data for France. This shows some of the underlying possibilities for future flows. You see here the most developed countries are in red. This is the United Nations projection from 1950 up to 2050, almost, in global terms, almost no change. This is the least developed countries, the poorest countries, where problems of poverty are at their most acute, starting off in really quite modest levels in 1950s. These are mostly African countries, but also others, now up to approaching 2 billion, and of course likely to be, these are the ones where the demographic transition is least advanced, and therefore where the numbers are going to increase most rapidly. As you see, there's no sign of any tailing off in the rate of growth here, whereas in this is the world, in the less developed world, excluding those, there's a stabilization going on, as we see in the reduction in the birth rate in China, in India, and various other countries. The economic disparities which, which help to drive migration are certainly great, and or certainly were increasing, at least up to the end of this graph. This line here is the GDP per head in US dollars for various European countries. There's France, Italy, Spain, and Germany in this group here. Down here is Turkey, Morocco, Algeria and Egypt, showing growth but not catching up at all with what's going on there, despite improvements and progress. And here is a more focused example of the difference in pattern of growth. The red line here is a population of the North African countries, which send migrants to France and Italy particularly, but also elsewhere, showing that they were about the same as those in southern Europe. That's the blue line in 1990, and according to the United Nations, are likely to diverge in this very remarkable fashion. The scale starts at 100, notice. This is not zero, that's 100 million. And something similar with Turkey. The scale starts here at 20 million at the bottom. It's not zero. In 1950, France, Italy, and the UK had twice the population of Turkey. By 2050, almost certainly, because of population momentum, they will have half the population of Turkey, and Turkey will have overtaken Germany on its way down. Which this is something which has some bearing upon the negotiations to allow Turkey to join the European Union, which in due course, of course, would mean a free movement of labour. What proportion of the world's population are immigrants? It has gone up, but not by all that much. The global proportion, as estimated by the United Nations, and you can imagine the problems of doing that, so don't put too much weight on it, is this fat line in purple with the little squares around it. And as you can see, although it's been going up, it started off at about 2% or just over 2% in 1960. It's now gone up to just about 3%. That, of course, represents quite a large increase in the total number of people. This represents getting on for about 170 million people. Nonetheless, as a proportion of the world population, it's important to realize that it is not great and is only increasing modestly. Surprisingly, perhaps, the pattern of population proportion in Latin America and in Asia that are migrants has not been increasing very much. This is Latin America, this is Asia. These data are probably the least reliable of those on this graph. Nonetheless, that's what the data tell us insofar as there are any data. The increase has been in North America, which is here, which we know about, and also in Europe. The European graph, though, is exaggerated, and once again I've got to revert to this tiresome topic of the unreliability of migration data. This big jump, which has been smoothed by the graphing program, this big jump here is not an unusually large upsurge of migrants into Europe. Instead, it arises out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, there were 25 million people living in the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union who had so-called Russian nationality. This is an official category in Soviet terms, which is a kind of official ethnic origin label. And those individuals had Russian nationality. Suddenly, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, they became foreigners. They became foreigners instead of citizens in Afghanistan, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. 25 million in all. Some went back, some did not, but those were then counted as foreign, and that's why this graph jumps up. In fact, had the Soviet Union not collapsed, one might assume that the graph would be like this, going up, but not with this enormous increase of a sudden kind. This is an example of long-term migration, just to show how erratic migration can be. This is the trend of migration to the United States. Again, this is inflow. There are no net migration data from the US. Going back to 1820, it's one of the longest sequences of reasonably reliable data that we've got, as you probably realize, increasing considerably, but in a very erratic way as time went on. Also important to realize that the United States had a very restrictive policy on migration after 1922. Not wishing to see the proportion of people of different origins change beyond the census, that of the census of, I think, 1900. And that brought it down to a very low level, which only gradually recovered until the passage of legislation in the 1960s facilitated this major increase to the present level, which is about 1 million, roughly speaking 1 million net, gross inflow of legal migrants into the US, with several 100,000 illegal migrants also. This huge spike here, yes, I'm sorry, another tedious example of misleading data. This arises from the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, whereby very large numbers of persons who had entered illegally were legalized. They were then counted as immigrants in that year, even though they'd been in the US for many years previously. So this spike is fake and referred to migration back here, which is not counted. We'll see something like that later on. This is net migration into the UK from 1963, the first time that data are available, up to 2009. The present level, about net 240,000, about 250,000 extra people added per year as a result of international migration. And this is that divided by citizens. These are UK citizens below in blue and in green. Almost invariably negative, continuing the pattern of emigration from the UK, which has been going on ever since the 17th century or earlier, and the foreign citizens in red and in orange. showing a very considerable increase up to about 300,000 net inflow per year. And this divide, and the need to have it in two different colours, is because there's a discontinuity in migration statistics in 1991, which means they're not exactly parallel, or rather comparable. And this is just to show that the net immigration into the EU15 is roughly of the same magnitude as the gross inflow into the US. The EU15 here is in blue and black. The persons accepted for settlement in the US, the gross inflow is in red. The EU, of course, has a bigger population than the US. Nonetheless, it's not the case that the US is way ahead of Europe in terms of migration flows. It isn't, and probably won't be in the future. Also important to realise that migration can go down as well as up to reverse the usual financial services health warning. This is migration into Germany from 1954 up to 2007. Enormous inflow around 1990 arising out of, partly out of the collapse of communism and the rise of the inflows of persons of German origin, Aussiedler, into Germany, arising out of the German basic law. Also huge numbers of persons fleeing from the collapse of Yugoslavia around that time. That's one of the reasons why this peaked at that time. Legal changes and the return of some kind of peace, Yugoslavia has allowed that to decline. And migration to Germany has, in some years, actually been negative. This is zero, and here it is down below zero in 2007. This is overall migration, net migration in Europe in 1997-2008. You can see in red the decline in migration to Germany, which I just described in the previous slide. The orange is that to the UK, showing the increase from the 1990s up to the present time, which I mentioned. These, of course, are overall numbers. Looked at in percent, the pattern's somewhat different. The percentage levels of inflows into Switzerland and the Netherlands, for example, are very high, and in some countries higher than in Britain. Nonetheless, the gross flows are, sorry, the overall terms of, in terms of people and not percent are, as far as we know, like that. I left these two out of that graph because otherwise they've distorted the scale. These are extraordinary levels of migration into Spain and Italy from 1997 onwards. In the past, Spain and Italy sent migrants to other European countries. Spain and Italy were on the poorer fringe, especially southern Italy, of the European industrial heartland. Lots of migrants went from Spain and Italy, also Greece and Portugal, into Germany, the Netherlands and France in the 1960s and 70s in order to work. At the end of that period of time, the economy in those countries had grown so much that many of them went back. And so this great outflow of workers from those countries, from the poor periphery into the richer core, stopped and was reversed. They were countries of emigration. All that turned round in the 1990s. They become countries of immigration, particularly immigration from North Africa, much of it uncontrolled, informal, irregular or illegal, depending on which adjective you prefer. Eventually, these huge inflows were recognized progressively through amnesties in Italy, which is why as more people were counted, the numbers went up. Sorry, this is Spain and this is Italy. Most of this huge increase, up to 600,000, is a result of people who were previously not counted as having been in the country, being recognized, naturalized, put into the data, and therefore pushing up the numbers to this enormous level. It's since gone down quite considerably. But that's a whole order of magnitude different from the inflows into the rest of Europe, almost as much as that moving into the US for a few years. What are the consequences? Very considerable. I'll skip that graph because I'm running out of time. First of all, nowadays, compared with the number of births, net migration is very large indeed. It's no longer the statistical weak sister of demographic change. It is the paramount agent in population dynamics. What matters here are the solid numbers in the right-hand column. You can ignore the rest. This shows the number of net migration into that country in respect to the number of births. and there were 44% more migrants into Spain in 2007 than there were births. This is not comparing it with a natural increase, it's comparing it with births. So more people were moving into Spain by migration than were born into Spain. About the same number in Switzerland and Italy, large numbers in Norway and Belgium, rather small numbers elsewhere. So a very important component of population growth, of population addition in those countries. In some countries, facilitating further increase in numbers. In other countries, slowing down or stopping or reversing population decline, which their low birth rates would otherwise have generated. In the UK, migration is projected by the Office of National Statistics to have a very, very powerful effect upon population size. Here we are in 2008 at about 63 million people. This blue line is the ONS central projection, their basic idea about what's going to happen as a consequence of TFR remaining at 1.84 and migration assumed to be net 180,000 per year and mortality declining in some gradual fashion. Increasing, as you see, to about 77 million by mid-century and 86 million by 2081. 2081 is an awful long time in demography. The one certain thing is that this will not happen in detail, but this is the implication of what will happen if the population continues in that pattern. And of course, we know now that migration in the last few years has not been 180,000, it's not been this one, it's been about 240,000. That happens to be roughly the high migration estimate of the ONS, and so this is what the population trajectory would be were migration to remain in net terms at the present level and TFR to remain at 1.84. At the moment it's 1.95, in fact, so even higher than that. I'm sure this will not come to pass, but it does show you rather powerfully what the implications of migration are and how important migration is compared with the natural increase. This is the natural change projection showing what would happen if there were no migration in or out. Some increase, as you see, thanks to population momentum, then returning to the present level by about 2061. All the rest of the increase is the direct and indirect consequences of international migration as projected. Same thing in Sweden. Age structure. This is a diagram from the EU showing in percentage terms the age distribution of migrants into the EU compared with the settled population into the EU. It is not a diagram showing the relative size of the population, only the relative shapes of the population. It's very important to realize. These are the migrants, this is the settled population. And you can see that it looks as though migration will rejuvenate population because it does not, for the most part, involve older people. Migrants are moving in roughly at sort of peak working age. This is age 25 here. And therefore, that should be a very considerable benefit to the potential workforce and also should be a brake on population aging. Well, it certainly is a brake on population aging, and there was, about 15 years ago, a tremendous interest in the possibility of encouraging migration in order to stop population aging, so-called replacement migration, which was provoked by a very interesting publication of the United Nations in the year 2000. You can't actually solve population aging by migration. It's very important to realize, and that is now taken for granted in all learned publications, even though journalists and politicians occasionally bring the idea up from time to time. This is what would happen to the UK potential support ratio at different levels of migration. The black line is what would happen to it at what was then the level of migration of 95,000 back in 1998, I think it was. This is what would happen with 1 million migrants per year. As you see, it greatly increases it. It greatly improves the support ratio, the ratio of people of working age to people of retirement age for a while, but eventually it goes down and will eventually reach quite low levels. This is just inevitable and is true of any population and any level of migration. And this is the level of migration which you require in order to keep that line at the 4.2 level which we saw before in terms of the consequences of migration. You would need increasing numbers of migration, which would take the UK population up to 120 million by mid-century, 306 million by the end of the century, and so on upwards into the stratosphere. It moderates aging, it can't solve it, nothing can solve it. The Economic arguments for large-scale migration have been well rehearsed over the last 15 years. I have spent too much time on other topics to be able to deal with these even in the simplest outline. Essentially, the case for it is for an increasing gross domestic product, which undoubtedly it does because that's a function of population, that it brings a tax benefit which is bigger than the welfare cost, that it's required for labour needs, and it does the natives no harm in terms of their employment or standard of living. Some of these things are true, some I think are not true. Generally speaking, lots of studies appear to show that the fiscal effect is rather small and maybe negative. The balance between the tax benefit of migration and the welfare costs of migration. That the result depends very much on where the migrants come from. Migrants from poor countries on the whole generate a deficit. Migrants from rich countries on the whole generate a surplus. And the balance depends upon the balance of migration and various other things between those two major categories of person. I've put some examples here which you might want to follow up later on. Labour migration, the case I think is stronger. There are many frictional processes and shortages which make people find labour migration attractive or even essential for filling unfilled vacancies. That can't be denied. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, we still find that unemployment is higher among first and second generation migrants in most European countries. Labour force participation rates are lower, particularly among women, among such persons, and that has got to be remembered. The controversy rumbles on, and the literature on it is very great, and some of my reading lists have got references to that. There's a strategic problem in the sense that easy access to labour, which naturally any sensible, self-respecting employer will want to encourage, irrespective of origins, may not be very good for the conditions of life of poorer, badly educated people in the receiving countries. This is one of the great centres of controversy at the present time. And if there's a constant supply of labour, then the awkward need to make semi-unemployable young people in the rich countries who may have had a very bad education, who may have a very bad work ethic, to make them into potential workers, it can be ignored because you don't need them, you can get them from overseas. And that is, I think, a kind of moral hazard or a political hazard of too easy access to overseas labour for employers, however beneficial for them and for the migrants it may be. Finally, continued migration from one population to another, naturally, at the end of the day, particularly if the receiving population has below replacement levels of fertility, will replace one population with another. This is very difficult to avoid. This is what is happening at the present time. This is a projection of the long-term ethnic change in the UK under different migration scenarios, showing the decline of the projection of the population of so-called white British origin. This, as you know, is one of these rather unpleasant, awkward categorizations of people which people are invited to label themselves with in the census and in a wide variety of other national government and local government inquiries. And this shows the trend downwards. This is the trend upwards in a number of different projections made by various European statistical offices, showing the percentage of people of foreign origin in European countries going up from between 8 and 18% at the present time in various European countries, up to 20 or 30% by mid-century, assuming, like the previous projection, that migration rates remain as they are. So very considerable ethnic change likely to take place has already indeed happened, where 25% of births in Britain, Germany and France are to women born abroad. So, some conclusions. I'm sorry to have not lived up to my expectation of ending at 5:2. Migration is a very, very heterogeneous process. This makes theory difficult, it makes data difficult, and puts into a slightly different category from births and deaths. Now the primary driver of population change in developed countries and is stopping population decline in some countries and greatly accelerating it in others like Britain, like the US, like Sweden. Some countries still have very modest levels of migration despite being very rich in the developed world. Japan, for example, has been resistant to migration, although many say that it needs it in view of its very low birth rate and its increasing labour shortages. The economic consequences are mixed and controversial. Its demographic consequences are that it can moderate but certainly can't solve any more than can high fertility, population ageing. But it does, if continuing at the present time, will lead to a very substantial transformation of population in terms of origin of a permanent kind. Thank you.